So one of the things we're trying to focus on is sleep health. And Dr. Bicey, who is a member of our team here as well, put out this paper recently talking about this concept of sleep health as opposed to simply talking about sleep disorders. And in this paper, he really argues the fact that it's really important to think about health from this perspective because all throughout population health, we're focusing more on the positive side of it, the positive role for sleep, the positive aspects of well-being. Sleep health is also important because it identifies a range of normal. There's not one precise answer for every single person, but there is a range. And sometimes we have a hard time understanding what that range is. We can clearly tell if somebody's sleeping well or if somebody's sleeping poorly, but sort of that gray area in between we need better identification of. Sleep health provides us a way to measure health. So a health promotion effort such as weight loss or eating better, things where we want to help people be healthier, sleep health should be part of that. You think about oral health, you think about behavioral health, but we also need to be thinking about sleep. The problem is that this concept of sleep health has been infrequently used in the scientific literature. Dr. Bicey does a whole description of the lack of papers and research articles out there that have used this concept. In addition, it's very poorly defined. And so he provides this definition for us to think about sleep health. And again, it's a big paragraph, a lot of words, but the idea is basically there are a lot of things that go into sleep. So it's multidimensional. We're asleep, we're awake, it's individual. There's social factors, environmental factors, things around us that help us be healthy and help us with our well-being. We need good sleep health, and it's characterized by subjective satisfaction. That means I feel like I've slept well. Subjective is my opinion. Appropriate timing is when we sleep. Most of us should be sleeping at night. Adequate duration means sleeping enough hours. High efficiency means when you're in bed sleeping, you're sleeping. So if you spend 10 hours in bed and you sleep all 10 of those hours, that's 100% efficiency. But if you spend 10 hours in bed and you only sleep 6 of those 10 hours, that's a 60% sleep efficiency. And most people will tell you that they don't sleep well when they spend a lot of time in bed not sleeping. And as well, we want sleep health to help us during the day. So sustained alertness means staying awake, being alert, being able to do the things that we want to do, and doing them well during our waking hours. Sleep really is a pillar of health. So again, the Army really caught on to this, and they have a new campaign out there promoting activity, nutrition, and sleep. And they call this the performance triad. And what's really nice about this is they're not just targeting this towards their soldiers, but toward the entire families, and really coming up with strategies and ideas and ways to help people obtain sufficient sleep along with being active and eating right. The National Sleep Foundation, who is one of our advocate partners for this project, has also caught on to this idea of sleep health, and in 2014 did a national survey using what they call the Sleep Health Index. And this includes a lot of those factors that Dr. Bicey talked about in terms of timing, duration, and those types of things. And in fact, they're so hot on the sleep health is that they have created a journal dedicated to sleep health. And all of the articles in here are hoping to have a focus at some aspects of what we are talking about. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine, in conjunction with the CDC, has also put forth a sleep health campaign called Sleep Well, Be Well, and these are just some of their recommendations in terms of how much sleep you get, things to avoid that will affect your sleep, having a consistent schedule, and seeking help if your sleep is not good. What's really important to understand is that sleep is not for slackers. That is a common belief in our society. And even with this sign, coffee, you can sleep when you're dead. My brother used to tell me this all the time when I was in grad school and I complained about how much I had to do. He'd just say, Lisa, you can sleep when you're dead. The truth of the matter is, yes, you can sleep when you're dead. But if you don't sleep, you will be dead a lot faster. So really, it's important to be sleeping as much as we can. So here are some basics about sleep. If you go in for an overnight sleep study in a sleep lab, they will hook you up and use your brain waves to help them tell you what stage of sleep you're in. They're also looking for your quality of breathing, your respirations, your heart rates, your movements, all of those types of things. But this would be an example of a picture at the end of a night of sleep. And so what you see here is the very top line is you're awake. And it takes most people about somewhere between 10 and 20 minutes to fall asleep. Up to 30 minutes is considered normal. In the first part of the night, you go into your very deepest stage of This is called slow wave sleep because your brain waves are moving nice and slowly. This is very deep sleep. Children especially have a lot of this sleep. As we go through adolescence, that amount of deep sleep declines into adulthood, but it's still the first part of our night. At the last part of our night, those red lines that you see is our REM sleep, or our dreaming sleep, where our brain waves are very active, but our body is basically paralyzed, and that prevents us from acting out our dreams. At the end of each of these cycles, you see that we have a brief arousal, and that's really important because all of us wake up somewhere between 2 and 6 times a night. That's totally normal. For most of us, we roll over and we go right back to sleep, and you don't even remember that you've awakened during the night. But for people who have sleep issues or medical issues or other types of factors, they will often wake fully and feel as if they don't get a good night's sleep. For young children, sleep cycles last about 1 hour. So when parents complain that my child wakes up every hour on the hour, it's true. Those children are waking up every hour on the hour. What's more of a problem is that child doesn't know how to go back to sleep without alerting their parent or without requiring some sort of intervention. So what we often tell families is whatever the circumstance is going to be in the middle of the night, be it having a child in your bed or doing something like that, should be the same as at bedtime. So a parent who helps their child to fall asleep at bedtime will then be required to help their child fall back to sleep with each normal arousal throughout the night. This next picture is called sleep homeostasis. This is the first of a 2-factor model. Sleep propensity on the slide means sort of that drive for sleep or that need for sleep. The 7 that you see across the bottom, that's 7 a.m. Here's 7 a.m., here's 11 p.m. And over the course of the day, that need for sleep builds and it builds and it builds. You have more and more pressure for sleep. You are all sleepier now than you were when you woke up. And when I finish my talk, not because I'm boring, but because it's an hour later, you will all be sleepier than you are right now. So that pressure builds and builds and builds until you reach this tipping point, this dotted line. For adults, the tipping point is about 16 hours. After 16 hours, we need to sleep. Many of us do not. We push through, we find ways to compensate. But after 16 hours of wakefulness, all functioning declines. So your reaction time, your processing speed, your mood, all of those types of things are very much affected when you don't fall asleep after 16 hours of wakefulness. In the first part of the night, you have so much pressure that you fall asleep and you have this very deep sleep. So if the phone rings, it's very easy to go back to sleep. You're not distracted, things like that. As the night goes on, we lose that sleep pressure, though. So if something wakes you up around 4 or 5 in the morning, it's often very difficult to go back to sleep because you don't have that same pressure. And many times our minds will start thinking, and then you're up for the day. So 7 a.m. you wake up, and it starts over again. The second process of the 2-process model is called our circadian rhythm, which is our internal clocks. And we all felt this a few weeks ago when we changed and went on to daylight savings time and our clocks moved forward an hour. So again, up and down is sort of that pressure, that need for sleep, and here's 7 a.m. As the day goes on, our internal clocks help to keep us awake. And this is sort of represented down here. And then as the day goes on, that need for sleep again builds and builds until we go to sleep. Now our internal clocks run on about a 24.2-hour day, so slightly more than our wall clocks, our watches, that type of thing. So we're constantly working to keep our internal clocks in check with our external clocks. And we do this with meals, routines, schedules, all of these types of things. But the most important cues are darkness and light. And the reason why is in the afternoon, when darkness occurs, darkness cues the brain to make melatonin. And melatonin is a naturally produced hormone that helps our brain prepare for sleep. So our body produces melatonin, and that sets off a whole host of changes that prepare us for sleeping. And around 11 p.m. we fall asleep, and that melatonin continues to be released, which helps us stay asleep overnight. And at 7 a.m. our internal clock may not be fully ready to wake up, but we open our eyes and expose ourselves to bright light. And light tells the brain, don't make any more melatonin. And that light suppresses the melatonin. We wake up, and our day gets started. Now, when we go through puberty, as with every hormone that changes, so does melatonin. And the timing of melatonin changes. And we know this from a series of studies called Sleep Summer Camp, where they took a bunch of teenagers and they put them in the basement of a house with dim light 24 hours a day. So they had no clocks, no TVs, no time cues. And they let them catch up on their sleep for a week. And then they measured how much they slept, when they slept, and what time their melatonin was released. And as you go through puberty, the timing of melatonin moves later by about 1 to 2 hours. So for our teenagers, it is very difficult for them to fall asleep. So here it is, late afternoon, my melatonin is being released, and a teenager's at their peak of wakefulness. At 11 p.m., when I'm ready to go to sleep, they're just having their melatonin released. And at 7 a.m., when I'm finally waking up, look at that. Teenagers are at their peak of sleepiness. And this is the biological argument behind changing high school start times. And I'll talk more about changing school start times later. But this is really important because a lot of teenagers complain about the difficulties falling asleep. And we mostly attribute that to things like homeworks and jobs and extracurricular activities. But it's also just the fact that they're not sleepy when they should be falling asleep. Now, our circadian rhythms, our internal clocks, can get very thrown off. And I'll talk about that more later when we talk about irregular sleep schedules. But in theory, these two processes work together. As the day starts, we don't have much sleep pressure, and as the sleep pressure builds, our internal clock is helping to keep us awake. And then as that sleep pressure is released overnight, our internal clocks help to keep us asleep. And so in the ideal world, these are the two mechanisms regulating our sleep. Now, sleep, how does it change over with development? Clearly, the sleep of a baby is not the same as the sleep of a child or an adolescent. So these are the recommended ranges provided by the National Sleep Foundation in terms of how much sleep should a child get. And it's really important to keep in mind these are ranges, but many people become very worried if their child falls outside of these normal ranges. And what we really know about sleep is that it looks more like this. And this looks like many of the growth charts that you may have seen. So here we have the 50th percentile line, and these long dashed lines are the 25th and 75th percentiles. And what you can see is a wide range in terms of the amount of sleep. So using an example, a 4-year-old, that could range anywhere from 9.5 to 14 hours of sleep would be considered normal. Now granted, most of the kids will fall in the middle of this range, similar to the National Sleep Foundation's recommended amount, but many kids fall outside of that range. And so it's really important to understand that sleep need is very individualized. So talking specifically about age groups, and I include preschoolers because our measure will start with the young ones around 5 years of age, but their sleep patterns include a total sleep time of 11 to 12 hours. The most significant change for preschooler sleep is that naps decrease. So at 3 years, almost all children are napping. But at the age of 5, almost 1 in 4 children are still napping. So that's many kids will need that nap up until the day they start kindergarten. In this age group, routines are really important for helping children sleep. The cognitive kicks in, so children start thinking, they start imagining, and all of a sudden there's monsters at night. And all of that cognitive reasoning of, I'm going to bed, but you're not, and that's not fair, kicks in and can make the bedtime very difficult. So that leads to bedtime resistance, testing the limits, and those types of fears. This is also the peak age of sleep problems, including parasomnias, which are sleep terrors and sleepwalking, and obstructive sleep apnea. And I'll talk more about those disorders specifically in a few minutes. Our school-age children should be golden sleepers. In theory, they sleep 10 to 11 hours at night, and they don't nap during the day. But what we now know is that about a third of school-age children experience some type of sleep problem, and the most common type of problem is anxiety. So difficulties falling asleep because they can't shut their mind off, or they wake in the middle of the night and they become very worried. Some of the sleep practices in this age group are changes to sleep schedules, a lot of school activities, technology, and while parents may be very involved in a 3 to 5-year-old's bedtime, by the time the child hits the age of 8, 9, 10, parents are not necessarily standing right over them every step of the way. Our teenagers need 9 to 9.25 hours of sleep, and we know that from the Sleep Summer Camp studies. The problem is that the majority of teenagers in America are getting 7 hours or less of sleep per night. And then what they do is on the weekends they oversleep, trying to catch up on their sleep, so they sleep in very late. And again, that irregular sleep schedule can be very problematic. Practices in this age group is the use of caffeine and energy drinks and a lot of technology in the bedroom, and those can very much interfere with sleep. In terms of sleep disturbances, we have this crossroads between the biological change, which means that timing of the melatonin that happens later, and then all of the extrinsic factors around them, such as homework and jobs and after-school activities. And what it results in is a significant cumulative sleep debt. The majority of teenager patients that I see come in because parents can't wake them up in the morning simply because they are so sleepy. These are my 3 favorite faces of deficient sleep. So when you're not getting enough sleep, you will become sleepy, dopey, or grumpy. So we used to think they're just dwarves, but this is literally what happens to you if you're not sleeping enough. So in kids, what we see are a lot of mood and affect changes. And every parent can tell you when they see their child, they either have major meltdowns or they become very surly. They can tell you and notice those differences. We also see a lot of problems or changes to behavior, noncompliance, aggression, hyperactivity, and poor impulse control. And these are very much the identical symptoms used to diagnose a child with ADHD. Sorry, I saw something pop up, a question about teenagers. I'll come right back to it. So ADHD symptoms mimic or look very much like a child who hasn't slept. And that becomes problematic because some children may be diagnosed with ADHD if they're simply not sleeping enough. But for children who have ADHD, sleep is very problematic. One very interesting study done out of Canada took very healthy 8 to 12-year-old kids and had them go to bed just 1 hour later for 5 nights. And at the end of the week, the teachers who did not know how much sleep they had gotten that week were rating them almost clinically significant levels of ADHD, in particular the inability to sit still, the inability to pay attention, and this emotion regulation, these mood changes. So just 5 nights of going to bed 1 hour later, they were able to induce these ADHD symptoms. We also see significant neurocognitive deficits, attention, memory, and executive functioning. One of the first studies done in Israel took 2nd, 4th, and 6th graders and had half the group go to bed 1 hour later for 4 nights, and half the group went to bed 1 hour earlier for 4 nights. So on average, the two groups, one was sleeping about 30 minutes more, and the other was sleeping about 30 minutes less than they regularly did. At the end of that week, the two groups were scoring a grade level difference in terms of neurocognitive performance. So again, short-term memory, attention, problem-solving skills. 4 nights of going to bed just 1 hour later or 1 hour earlier resulted in significant changes to neurocognitive performance. We also see weight gain when children and adolescents aren't sleeping enough. Again, in very controlled studies where kids go to bed either 1 hour later or teenagers only spend 6.5 hours in bed, you see increased caloric intake, somewhere in the range of 150 to 200 calories per day, and almost all of those extra calories are consumed after 7 p.m. You also see the choice of foods change in that most of the kids will pick higher fats, higher carbs, and in particular sweets, such as cookies. And finally, deficient sleep has a very significant effect on parent and family functioning. If a child's not sleeping, oftentimes parents are not sleeping as well. Yes, the question related to the effects of smartphones and TVs on teenagers is very similar, and I will be discussing that in a couple of minutes. All right, so how can you tell if your child or a child you know is not getting enough sleep? Well, falling asleep eating, that's a very good clue. If a child needs to be awakened in the morning, and I mean really awakened, you know, you should be able to go in and wake your child, say, Johnny, time to get up. And within about 15 minutes, Johnny is up and moving. May not be pleasant, but is up and moving. But if you have to go in and it takes an hour and lots of shaking and lots of shouting and throwing ice cold water on your child to wake them up, that's problematic. If your child, these are true for adults as well, if you're sleeping 2 or more hours on weekends or vacations compared to weekdays, that's oversleep, and that's the body trying to catch up and reduce the amount of sleep debt that you have. If a child falls asleep in school or other inappropriate times, for example, we had a school-age child fall asleep on a speedboat that the family was out on an adventure one day. That would be rather an inappropriate time. You would not expect a child to fall asleep in that situation. And then again, fill in the blank. Following a night of good sleep or following a night of poor sleep, what do you notice different about your child? What do you notice different about yourself? Everybody can identify sort of that thing that gets worse when you haven't slept well. Your mood, your reaction time, your ability to be a patient parent. Kids become more irritable, incorrigible. That's my favorite word that a parent used. All right, so in theory, sleep should be very easy, right? We go to sleep and we wake up. But in actuality, sleep is quite difficult. There are a number of pediatric sleep disorders that interfere with a child's ability to sleep well and obtain that sleep health that we were talking about. Obstructive sleep apnea is one of the most common, and this is a disorder usually caused by enlarged tonsils and adenoids in children. And so it's a lot of snoring. Snore, 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 pause, and then you hear this, and the child goes back to snoring. And with each of those pauses, those apneas, the brain has to kick awake. That's what that gasping sound, wake up, and so the person wakes up and goes back to snoring. what ends up happening is instead of waking 2 to 6 times a night, you now have a child who's waking 5 to 10 times an hour, and that will result in a significant sleepiness during the next day. Narcolepsy is a disorder of daytime sleepiness. It's not that common in children, but can occur. And this is a child who appears to be obtaining sufficient sleep at night, but is then also excessively sleepy during the day. So, for example, that child who fell asleep on the speedboat was diagnosed with narcolepsy. Periodic limb movement disorder, PLMD, or RLS is restless leg syndrome. And these are two disorders that often go hand in hand. Restless leg syndrome is a feeling of discomfort in the legs, often described as creepy crawly, tingling sensations, firecrackers, soda bubbles. Kids have lots of creative ways of describing these. And these feelings in the legs get worse in the evening and are made better by rubbing or moving. And for most kids, the treatment for restless leg syndrome is iron therapy. We have found that a number of children with RLS have very low ferritin, a type of iron in the blood. PLMD is a movement disorder during sleep where a child has repetitive kicking, twitching, jerking movements during sleep, which again causes them to have more arousal and more daytime sleepiness. Partial arousal parasomnias are sleep terrors of sleepwalking, sleep talking. They're all the same type of disorder. They just look different. So a sleep terror is a child who sits up, starts screaming like a banshee, and like 3 or 4 minutes later falls back over and goes right back to sleep. Sleepwalking is a child who gets up out of bed, walks down the hallway, pees in a closet, walks back to bed, and goes right back to sleep. Children have no recollection of these events. Partial arousal parasomnias occur in the first third of the night because they typically occur when we're coming out of that very deep sleep that I talked about earlier. So during that transition from sleep to wakefulness, they get stuck. This is different from nightmares, which occur in the last third of the night, because nightmares are related to dreaming, and we get our REM sleep in the last third of the night. So to differentiate between the two, we often ask who is more afraid. During sleep terrors or sleepwalking, parents are more fearful because their child doesn't look like they normally do. And during a nightmare, a child will be very distressed and will be able to tell you about the dream. Insomnia is one of the most common disorders we see in children, and this is across all ages, difficulties falling asleep and staying asleep. And then circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders, and in particular for adolescents, that delayed sleep-wake phase. So what I showed you on that circadian rhythm graph, the movement or that delayed circadian rhythm, for somebody with a disorder, they literally can't fall asleep before 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. But if they go to bed at that time, they'll fall asleep quickly and they'll sleep great. The problem is that delayed sleep phase is not conducive to getting up and going to school. There are a number of effective treatments for all of these sleep disorders that I've just mentioned. So Carol Marcus, who's one of our clinical partners in this project, led up the effort to put out clinical practice guidelines from the American Academy of Pediatrics talking about the diagnosis and management of childhood obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine has put out practice parameters for circadian rhythm sleep disorders. Jody Mindell, another clinical partner of this project, led up the effort for the practice parameters for the treatment of bedtime problems and night wakings in infants and young children. More recently, Jody and I worked together to look at behavioral interventions for insomnia across all age groups, showing that there are a number of very effective treatments. And also keeping in mind that these treatments can work across age groups. So the Autism Treatment Network has a sleep group that put together this practice pathway that has been really very helpful for identifying, evaluating, and treating insomnia for children with autism spectrum disorders. Just again showing you more aspects of effective treatments. There's clinical guides that provide treatments for every type of disorder, be it biological or medical, as well as books for parents and families. So take charge of your child's sleep, snooze or lose, and solving sleep problems for children with autism spectrum disorders. This just highlights how common sleep issues are and how much information we need to be putting out there. Now, another factor that very much interferes with sleep are comorbid medical diagnoses. So children with asthma who are wheezing and coughing at night, children with severe eczema who are scratching and itching at night, chronic pain makes it very difficult to sleep, cystic fibrosis, diabetes, and epilepsy. Studies have shown that disruptions in sleep, reflux, rheumatology conditions, and sickle cell disease. We have a number of disorders that each of these disorders affect the ability to sleep. And then in turn, when you're not sleeping well, that can affect the ability to manage the disorder. So for example, a child who has pain doesn't sleep well, and when they don't sleep well, they have less regulatory ability or they're less able to manage their pain. This is just some data from where I work here at National Jewish, and just a quick summary. AD is atopic dermatitis in red, asthma. This is children with atopic dermatitis and asthma. This is children who require ventilatory support, and these are typically in green, typically developing children. And we ask parents, how frequently do your children wake at night? And in terms of children who wake less than once a week, you can see about 95% of children who are typically developing, they sleep great, whereas about 20 to 30% of kids with a chronic illness are waking at least once a week. It becomes even more striking when you ask how often is your child child night waking 5 to 7 nights a week, and you don't see that at all in any of the typically developing children. But you see that again in almost 40 to 60% of children with a chronic illness are waking 5 to 7 times a week during night. And again, when children wake up, so do their parents. So we asked parents, why are you waking at night? And the first reason was for caregiving. And again, as expected, you would see many parents are waking at night required to care for their child's health needs. There's not a lot we can do about that, because if the child has health issues, you absolutely have to care for them during the night. But what's been very striking in my research over the years is finding that 60 to 80% of parents wake up simply because they're stressed about their child's health. And that is a point of intervention that we could help parents with, in managing their own stress overnight to help them sleep better, which will help them manage their child's illness better. When we asked about general stress, paying bills, going to work, those types of things, those did not differ between the different disease groups. All right, so moving from medical disease into psychiatric diagnoses, as I mentioned before, ADHD and autism are two of the most commonly known groups to have sleep issues. And you think about what's required for sleeping, you have to be able to calm, self-regulate, and relax. And those are not really fortes for kids who have ADHD and autism. And so biologically, these kids are not programmed well for sleeping. And what you see is either difficulties falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, they wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they're up for the day, or some combination of all three of those. And so we know that these two groups in particular have a significant number of issues with sleeping. What you find is that the psych disorder predicts sleep issues, right? So we know kids who have psychiatric disorders have sleep issues. But again, as I was talking earlier, one of the issues is that children who have sleep issues can present with symptoms of a psych disorder, or if they actually have the psych disorder, the sleep issues can make that disorder worse. So you take an ADHD child who's not sleeping, and then they become even more hyperactive in their attempts to stay awake. This is some data looking at children in autism, and this was measured objectively with actigraphy, which is a wristwatch, kind of like a Fitbit, that measures sleep-wake patterns. What we found is that children are going to bed later. Children with autism are going to bed later, almost an hour later. We're waking almost a half an hour earlier. And in total, we're sleeping at least 30 minutes less per night. And what that means then is then families are sleeping less. So this is parent report, or parent sleep measured by actigraphy. Although we did not see differences in bedtimes for mothers and fathers, we did find that mothers and fathers of children with autism were waking significantly earlier than their counterparts. They spent less time in bed, and overall they were sleeping significantly less. So it really can affect an entire system if a child is not sleeping well. So we also see sleep issues in children with anxiety and depression, as well as aggression, conduct disorder, and addiction. Those last three we have less research on, but it's a growing area that people are thinking about. Now, I've mentioned all these biological issues, why kids are not sleeping. There are a number of extrinsic sleep disruptors, which are things in our environment or things around us that make it difficult to sleep. One of them is an irregular sleep schedule. Another is technology in the bedroom, caffeine, and school start times. So thinking about healthy sleep habits, especially those four areas, it is so critical to have a consistent sleep schedule with an age-appropriate bedtime. This is some data from the National Sleep Foundation looking at what happens in terms of sleep if you go to bed early, which is before 9 o'clock, or late after 9 o'clock. You can see we have a range of younger children here, but also school-age children. Kids who go to bed before 9 o'clock sleep at least an hour more. So having that early set bedtime is really important. In teenagers, we know that if parents set bedtime, those teenagers are less likely to be depressed and have a lower risk for suicide. We also see a number of inconsistent sleep schedules, in particular in teenagers. This is a great cartoon. Jeremy, get up. It's Saturday morning. Oh, but you're wasting the best part of the morning. And he says the best part of Saturday morning is Saturday afternoon. So that strong desire to sleep in is so common in teenagers. And what that ends up is something called social jet lag. And this is a phenomenon. I did not make this up. But in essence, teenagers give themselves jet lag every weekend. And this is what it would look like. When I used to live in Philadelphia, let's say it's Friday afternoon, and I decide to go visit my friends in California. So I hop on a plane, I drink a couple of Cokes to help me stay awake, because when I land in California, it's 8 o'clock, and my friends say, let's go out to dinner. And I say, oh, sure, it's only 8 o'clock, except that my internal clock still thinks it's 11 o'clock. But I power through. We're able to go for dinner. We have a great evening. Saturday morning and Sunday morning, we wake at 9 a.m. That's not so late, except that is noon on the East Coast. So in essence, I'm going to bed late, and I'm sleeping in. Sunday afternoon, I hop on the plane. I fly back to the East Coast. And at 11 o'clock, guess what? I can't fall asleep. Why? Well, first of all, I haven't been awake enough hours. Remember that 16 hours of wakefulness I needed? I've only been awake for 11 hours, so I'm not sleepy. Second, my internal clock only thinks it's 8 o'clock. It only takes 2 or 3 days to throw your internal clock off. So what that means is Sunday night I can't fall asleep. Monday morning I'm miserable. Monday night I'm still having trouble falling asleep. Tuesday night starts to get better. By Wednesday night I'm falling asleep okay. Thursday night I'm okay. And then lo and behold, it's Friday, and guess what? I'm going to hop on a plane and do it all over again. So this is this importance of maintaining a consistent schedule, going to bed, waking up at the same time every day is so important to help children and adolescents obtain sufficient sleep and good sleep quality. Another healthy sleep habit is having a relaxing bedtime routine. Everyone needs one, no matter how old you are. Our technology is fantastic. Click, on-off switch, done. Brains are not so fantastic that way. We need more like a dimmer switch. It takes our minds quite a while to slow down. So we really strongly recommend having a consistent routine that does not include technology, but does include the same activities every night to help prepare the body for sleeping. We do want people to sleep in a bedroom that's cool, dark, comfortable, and technology-free. And this goes back to that question about smartphones and TVs. We know that at least 72% of youth have at least one device in the bedroom. This does include TVs, tablets, smartphones, all of the technology that's so rapidly been increasing. 97% of 15 to 17-year-olds in America have some type of technology in the bedroom. 18% of teens report being awakened regularly by a cell phone ringing or a text message. And here's just some data showing the differences in the amount of sleep. If you have a television in the bedroom, a tablet or a smartphone, or some type of MP3 radio, you're sleeping 40 to almost 60 minutes less if you have the technology sometimes on in the bedroom at bedtime. We also strongly recommend limiting caffeine intake. What has caffeine? Some parents are always surprised when I tell them what has caffeine. So there's the usual suspects, right? Coffee, sodas, energy drinks. Sun-kissed orange soda, 42 milligrams of caffeine. That's almost as much as a Coca-Cola. Barq's root beer has caffeine in it. A&W cream soda has caffeine in it. Barq's diet root beer does not. A&W root beer does not. So it's really being aware that not all sodas are created equal. You can buy caffeine in water. You can buy Jitter Beans. A box of Jitter Beans would be equal to 7.5 cans of Red Bull or 11 cans of Mountain Dew. And kids do get a hold of this stuff and have a lot of caffeine. You can get caffeine in gum, in Snickers bars, and Butterfingers. One of my favorite, you can get caffeinated maple syrup. And one of the great products of Colorado, not the one that you first think of, but is Perky Jerky, caffeinated beef jerky. Who knew, right? So caffeine is out there. Kids are getting a hold of it, and it's definitely impacting their sleep. Here's just some data. 27% of preschoolers were consuming some type of caffeine. They were averaging 5 hours less sleep per week when they had caffeine. 75% of school-age children are regularly consuming caffeine, anywhere in the range of 52 to 109 milligrams per day. And the amount of caffeine was inversely correlated with sleep, which means the more caffeine you have, the less sleep that you're going to get. 85% of adolescents are having caffeine. They're averaging about 215 milligrams a day. And if you're wondering in perspective, we consider anyone who uses over 300 milligrams a day to be a high caffeine user. Now, with that in mind, a 16-ounce, which is the small size of a Starbucks coffee, has 320 milligrams of caffeine in it. A half a cup of Ben & Jerry's Java Java Buzz Buzz coffee ice cream has 84 milligrams of caffeine in it. So you can find kids are getting caffeine in a number of ways. Again, higher use of caffeine for children who fell asleep during school. So it's hard to tell, are they drinking caffeine to stay awake, or they have so much caffeine they don't sleep at night, so then they fall asleep during the day. We haven't determined that yet. But those who do use caffeine have a later bedtime, somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 minutes. Finally, for healthy sleep habits, of course, to control the internal clock, it's important to have bright light in the morning and to limit light exposure late in the day. Now, the final area I want to talk about is school start times, and this is, again, one of our advocate partners is Start School Later. Multiple studies, and this is just an example of some of the studies, have shown time after time the importance of later school start time, especially for middle and high school start-ins. And what we know is that students get more than 8 hours of sleep per night. They have less depression, less caffeine use, better academic outcomes, better attendance rates, higher graduation rates, reduced tardiness, and fewer car crashes. So really so many areas improve when you change school start times. The problem is it's really a complex political issue. Fortunately, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with their position statement last fall saying the evidence strongly implicates earlier school start times before 8:30 is a key modifiable contributor to insufficient sleep. So in other words, we can change school start times. If we do change school start times, we can help our kids get more sleep. So again, several members of this team that's helping develop our new measures have been very active and very vocal in changing school start times locally and nationally. It's so important to help our teens sleep better. So going back to sleep health and the 5 dimensions of sleep, these are things that are important for us to keep in mind as we move forward with the development of our measure. So that sleep duration, the total amount of sleep in 24 hours. And again, for kids, that can range anywhere from 8 to 12 hours, depending on the age. But getting that sleep duration is so important. That sleep continuity or efficiency. So when we think about falling asleep, is it easy to fall asleep? Can we stay asleep? Are we sleeping well? Is it continuous sleep? The timing of sleep. So again, in an ideal world, sleep timing would occur at night when it's dark, and we would be awake when it's light during the day. But for many, especially adolescents, that timing is very difficult where they fall asleep very late and have a hard time waking up. And then that alertness and sleepiness, we really want that ability to maintain attentive wakefulness. We want kids and adolescents to be alert and awake, to go to school and learn. That is their job. We know the importance of graduating from high school in terms of prospective long-term future for kids, so they need to be able to go to school to learn, to interact, and participate. And finally, the satisfaction or quality. This is a subjective assessment of good sleep or poor sleep. And when we do a lot of measurements of sleep, we've used objective measures like the overnight sleep study or the actigraph that I was mentioning, and those give us numbers, but they don't really tell you about the quality or how satisfied you feel with the sleep. And this is the sort of the most important area of the development of this new measure, is thinking about the patient's own outcome or the patient's own report of their sleep and the sleep quality. So we have 10 most commonly used measures that we reviewed as we were developing this project. A couple of these were developed by members of our core team here, the Children's Sleep Habits Questionnaire by Dr. Judy Owens, the Pediatric Daytime Sleepiness Scale by Dr. Chris Drake. And these measures have been used in a number of studies, and they each measure different aspects. But there are a number of limitations with these 10 measures. Only one of the 10 was developed with stakeholder input. And so we're very excited for the development of our measures to make sure we're getting the input from our stakeholders, including the children, the parents, the advocates, and the clinicians. Only one of those 10 measures used cognitive interviews to measure the item understandability. And this is something that we've been working on, where we present items to kids and parents and say, what does this mean to you? To ensure that what we're trying to ask is the same as how they're interpreting it. Most of those measures were developed for a single age group, either school-age children, adolescents, young child, but were not developed to allow us to measure sleep continuously over development. And that's problematic both for clinical purposes and research. We need to be able to have one measure that we can look at ages of 6, 10, 14, and 18 and look at changes of sleep over time. Most of those 10 measures do not include a self-report for children ages 6 to 12. Several of them were self-report for adolescents. Only one of them was a measure that school-age children could self-report. And again, parents are less involved when children hit sort of that middle childhood period and may not always be aware of difficulties falling asleep, difficulties staying asleep, and surely cannot report on sleep quality because that's an internal subjective report. And finally, only 2 of those 10 measures have been validated in other languages. Both have been in Spanish. The CSHQ, I think, has also now been into a couple of other languages. But we want to be able to have a measure that we can use across populations, not only in the United States, but around the world. We did some preliminary work and surveyed 60 sleep experts. They were both clinicians and researchers in the area of pediatric sleep. And we asked them, what do you want if we develop a new sleep measure? They said they want a measure that's responsive to changes in sleep. So we want to know if I, as a clinician, help you sleep longer, I want to know that this measure is going to capture that. Or as a researcher, we want to know that changing school start times and greater sleep, we're able to capture that this measure is responsive to those changes. We want to be able to measure sleep quality, sleep continuity, and daytime sleepiness and wakefulness. So again, hitting on those core components of sleep health, that is what the clinicians and researchers would like to do as well. Measures need to be brief, easy to score. For busy clinicians, it has to be something that can be filled out quick and scored quick so that you can quickly provide patients back with information. For researchers, again, anytime you have somebody in a study, you want to limit burden and how much they have to fill out and how many questions they have to answer. So we would like to have measures that are brief and easy to score. Age appropriate. We don't want to be asking kids questions that are really meant for adults. Many of the child measures were developed in a top-down approach, which means they were developed for adults and then sort of dumbed down for kids. And kids are not little adults. They're individual beings in their own right, and we need to make sure the questions we're asking are age appropriate and fit with their developmental stage. Again, we need to have measures that allow us to look at sleep over time and across the different developmental stages. We want to be able to measure sleep habits. There's very few measures out there that actually look at things like caffeine use, technology, and some of these things, these habits that can ensure better health, sleep health, or make sleep health worse. They also wanted measures that could be translated into Spanish, and they wanted measures that could be used for children with autism. So that leads us to our current project. And of course, as you're all well familiar at this point, our aim is to develop new self-report measures of sleep health for children and adolescents. We want measures to be used by patients and families, clinicians, researchers. We want everybody to understand what sleep health is and to be able to evaluate their own sleep health. Again, in clinical settings, interventions, if we treat sleep apnea, if we treat narcolepsy, if we treat insomnia, are we improving sleep quality, not just sleep quantity? We also want to be able to monitor sleep over time and development. And with this project and having the input of all of you, we will be addressing limitations of previous measures, providing this brief, valid, and normed item banks to capture sleep health. And that last part's also really important, that normative part, because I want to be able to know if I fill out this questionnaire about my child, or my child fills out the questionnaire about themselves, can they compare that measure to other children? Where do they fall in the continuum of sleep health? And so the project will allow us to be able to look at comparisons for normative data. So, in sum, sleep health is essential. I hope I beat that over your head, that everybody's going to really focus now on having a consistent sleep schedule. Your dentist tells you to brush and floss twice a day. Your doctor tells you to eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day. You're supposed to exercise 30 minutes a day. You're also supposed to go to bed and wake up at the same time every day. I get that people don't do it, but it really does make a huge difference when people do. Sleep changes with development. The sleep of an 8-year-old is not the same as the sleep of an 18-year-old. There are a number of biological changes as well as changes in the environment that affect sleep over time. There are a number of biological, physiological disorders and behavioral disorders that really affect child's sleep, both sleep quality and sleep quantity. The good news is that there are a lot of very effective treatments to address all of these sleep issues. If the sleep issues go unaddressed, however, deficient or disrupted sleep will significantly impact not only the child's functioning, development, and learning, but parent functioning and family functioning as well. This is especially true for children who have some type of medical or developmental disorder. And finally, new measures are needed to capture sleep health in children and adolescents, and that is where this project comes in. And so I am going to end there. Thank you, everyone, for your time. I believe I left a few minutes for questions because I talked so fast. So I open the floor.
Lisa, this is Catherine. Thank you so much. I found this presentation to be really, really helpful to help me anyway think about some of the key issues that we're going to address in developing these item banks. I'm wondering what your thoughts are a little bit more specific to the issue around developmental change in sleep quantity, I guess, or continuity maybe, and then certainly with respect to practices. Mm-hmm. What your thoughts are on sort of how we may be able to deal with that, because we're, I think, trying to develop item banks that are appropriate for use across some of the developmental span, especially like the kind of kindergarten age, like 5, early childhood, or early elementary, like 5, right. 6, and especially as they transition into adolescence. Do you foresee us facing some particular challenges on any one domain, like practices, or do you feel like there are some universal concepts here that will be applicable to children of all ages?
I think the domain, the sleep practices, would certainly be the most difficult to capture the full spectrum. But that said, I think some of the data I showed, there is still high use of things like caffeine and technology in the bedroom, all the way down to kindergarten age. So I think those questions will still be relevant. They just may not be as prevalent. Does that make sense? So yeah, it may not be as common, but I do still think that including those items will capture something in the younger children. I don't know that we need to necessarily have a school age versus an adolescent measure for things like the sleep continuity and the alertness and the wakefulness. Those factors remain the same. The words that children use perhaps to describe their sleep might change slightly, but I think if we have words that are appropriate for our 6 to 10-year-old children, those would still be appropriate for teenagers. I feel grouchy because I didn't get enough sleep. Those types of things will be able to apply all the way into adolescence. So, I think it's one of the great unknowns of doing this because no one has really looked at one measure across those groups, but I think the way that we've looked at the items and the way that we've pulled them will be able to do this successfully. At least I hope so.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa. This is Barbara Howard. Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
That was a wonderful lecture, I have to say. It was really great. And a great way to get started. One of the things that struck me about your presentation, and also thinking about the other sleep measures that are available right now, is the impact on the parents. Yes. You probably know that we distribute an online system called Chattis, and one of the ways we deal with having a multiplicity of domains is to give a number of different tools and not try to cram them all into one tool, and also to make it algorithmic so that you don't get asked all the detailed questions if, in fact, sleep is going fine. You're not given all the questions about caffeine and sleep disruption and everything else. You start off with finding out the basics and then only later ask the other questions if necessary. But I hope that one of the results of this work that we're headed into here is to also be looking for comorbid mental health conditions, which may actually be a separate measure, and also the impact on the parents, which, as I said, I think that's important and makes a big difference in motivating them to work on sleep as well, because if they haven't connected their own distress to the child's sleep, they may not be as willing to deal with the child's resistance to making a change in sleep.
Right. And I think those are all great points, and Chris, Catherine, and chat folks, feel free to jump in if I don't get this right. But I think your Chattis series of measures is very similar with what the Promis initiative has created, which is a series of measurements using that computerized adaptive testing. So depending on how you answer questions will depend on which additional questions you will be asked. And so assessing sleep can be done in as little as 4 or 8 questions, especially if it's not a problematic area, whereas other item banks or other domains such as depression or subjective well-being can also be brought in to be measured simultaneously, again with a very small number of items. In terms of measuring it with the parents, I mean, I'm a big supporter of that. That's clearly my area of research. But I think the adult Promis measures allow us to provide sort of that concurrent measurement of both pediatric and adult sleep at the same time, and looking at the same issues with parents in terms of their sleep quality continuity as well as their daytime alertness and functioning. And so I think we'll have that ability, but I think long term that's one of the great areas about using this Promis measure for, or the item banks for children, is to again look at that full family functioning. And within Promis we also have some family, or soon to be released, I guess, family functioning types of item banks as well. So I think in combination with what's out there, these new item banks will really help us tap into those issues of comorbid illnesses as well as family functioning.
Great.
That's great, Lisa. This is Chris. I have a couple of questions. First is, do we know whether children who are poor sleepers have parents who are poor sleepers as well? I raise that because it's a little on your notion that maybe we should be in our work measuring the health of the parent, the sleep health of the parents at the same time we're measuring the sleep health of the kids. And the second question is are sleep problems on the same continuum as sleep health? So can you have a sleep problem and good sleep health in some domains? Or are sleep problems just poor sleep health, the low side of sleep health?
Correct.
Okay. So the first question is, in terms of children being poor sleepers, have parents who are poor sleepers. We don't have a ton of evidence of that. There's some suggestion that when parents have insomnia, their children may be more likely to develop insomnia, and so there's a little bit of evidence looking at that. There are just a very small number of studies that say if children aren't sleeping well, parents aren't sleeping well. But that's more of a sleep disruption. So if the child has a sleep disruption, that's disrupting the parent's sleep as well. So there's not a ton of evidence. The evidence that is out there would suggest that children who are poor sleepers have parents who are poor sleepers, mostly in the insomnia domain. You may also see that in terms of things like sleep apnea that can be genetic, not commonly, but can be genetic in terms of having a narrow airway. Or if obesity is a problem in the family, you would see that parents then will have children as well who end up being obese and may have sleep apnea. So in terms of whether or not we should be looking at that, I think it could be a very interesting secondary question of looking at that sort of relationship between poor sleep in children and poor sleep in parents. Sleep problems and sleep health are not the same, can be the same. So if you have poor sleep health, poor sleep habits, that could lead to sleep problems. So if you're drinking a lot of caffeine and you're having troubles falling asleep, the sleep health, the habits are related to the sleep problems. But a number of children will have sleep problems even if they have perfect sleep health. They still go to bed, wake up at the same time every day, they don't drink caffeine, they have technology-free bedrooms, but they still may have trouble sleeping. And again, biological reasons, they could have sleep apnea, they could have restless leg syndrome, insomnia. Again, I was mentioning earlier about anxiety is very common in children and is the most common reason that kids have insomnia. Delayed circadian rhythms. A child or a teenager can try and maintain good sleep health, but the pull of the circadian rhythm may make that very difficult for them in the long run. So I think sleep problems can be the same as sleep health, but it is not, they are not interchangeable.
Comes on mute unless that's a lot of background noise.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lisa, this is Paul Polkonis in Pittsburgh.
Hi.
It was great, very comprehensive. Appreciate all the information. As others have said, it's a great presentation. I guess just thinking about item bank development very concretely, you or others can remind me again about the youngest age for self-report that the current pediatric banks are intended to be used with?
I believe it's 8 years, and then parent report, parent proxy for 5 to 7 years.
Okay. All right. Well, that's consistent with our other Promis precedents. Then I may have misunderstood, but I thought a minute ago when you were talking about 6 to 10-year-olds, you were talking about self-report as young as 6. But I think the threshold we've used routinely, and the one that's most common in the list remains 8 years old. So.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Hey, Lisa, this is Dan Bicey. I just wanted to say hello and thanks for the talk, and I think it's a really good framework for moving forward.
Thanks, Dan. We love the idea of sleep health.
I mean, with regard to Promis, one kind of interesting thing. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say to your previous comment about the distinction between sleep health and sleep disorders. I agree with that too. But within the framework of sleep health that you were discussing is interesting in the sense that it may not all be accessible or even appropriate to typically developed patient-reported outcome measures. In that, for instance, in the article that I had published, the reason for focusing on certain domains is really what evidence in the literature leads us to, rather than what patients kind of view as important. So again, I think there are different ways for developing these assessments, and it'll be interesting to see what happens as the Promis measure goes along, to see if it really does kind of tap into those dimensions of sleep health that you had mentioned.
Yeah. Along the way so far, you have gotten very interesting feedback in terms of when we've sort of put concepts out there, asking, how do you know if you've had a good night of sleep, or, that type of thing, and hearing from the viewpoint of both children and their parents, I think has really given us some nice informative groundwork to start with. All right, well, I think we've hit our end of our hour unless there's any other questions.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This is Catherine. I just want to remind everyone, first of all, that we've been recording this so that our other partners who are not able to make the call today, in particular our parent and youth partners, will have a chance to review this. Also, for purposes of evaluating our engagement activities for the project, we're going to be circulating some sort of satisfaction and questions and opportunity for people to give feedback on this presentation for all of our stakes, and in particular so that we can guide the development of future learning sessions for the sleep group in the future. So thank you, everyone, for your participation, and please watch out for, I think, a REDCap survey, right, coming through very shortly about this presentation, and following that as well, some more general questions about engagement as well. We really appreciate everybody's full participation in that, because that's how we are going to be able to assess how we're doing with engagement and make improvements as we move forward as a team.
Great.